Her hands were steady against the wounded body, while the tent held nothing but broken breathing. If she stepped back now, the moment would end. But if she moved forward, the danger could reach her own life. War often turns mercy into a risk, and some choices are made without a single word spoken. This was the kind of silence Alina knew too well. Not peace, just the absence of noise before it returned louder. The canvas walls shifted gently with the wind, brushing against wooden poles that had been set up in a hurry weeks ago, maybe months. Time blurred in places like this. Nights stacked on top of each other until they all felt the same. Alina leaned closer to the cot and adjusted the lantern, careful to keep the light low. Too bright and someone might notice. Too dim and she'd miss something important. She de-learned that balance early, how survival often lived in the space between extremes. The man lying in front of her wasn't supposed to be here. She didn't need to study the uniform to know that. One glance had been enough. Enemy. The word came to her automatically, drilled in through months of repetition, whispered warnings, shouted orders. It was a word designed to simplify things, but nothing felt simple now. His breathing was shallow, uneven, as if his chest couldn't decide whether to rise or fall. Alina placed 2 fingers lightly at his neck, counting seconds the way she always did. There, still there, faint but present, alive. Outside the tent, boots crunched against the ground. A voice called out to someone else, distant enough not to matter yet. Alina's shoulders tightened anyway. In a place like this, distance was never a promise. She straightened, wiping her hands on a cloth already stained beyond saving. She told herself, just like she had so many times before, that this was about procedure, about training, about doing the job she'd signed up for. But even as the thought crossed her mind, she knew it wasn't true. Procedure didn't explain the hesitation she felt. Training didn't explain why her body had moved before her thoughts had caught up. And the job, well, the job was never supposed to look like this. She glanced at the tent flap again, listening. Quiet. Alina knelt beside the cot once more and carefully checked the bandage. It was holding, but barely. She'd need to replace it soon. The supplies here were limited, and she'd already used more than she should have on one person. One enemy person. Her fingers hovered for a moment before she touched him again. The pause wasn't medical, it was personal. She'd seen this pause in others before, new nurses, volunteers, people standing at the edge of a line they didn't know they'd be asked to cross. She exhaled slowly and went back to work. Up close, the man looked younger than she'd expected. Not a child, but not far from it either. His face was drawn tight with pain, skin pale under the dirt and sweat. There was no anger there, no defiance, just the quiet effort of someone trying to stay conscious. Alina swallowed. She'd grown up believing war was loud, explosions, shouting, chaos. No one had told her how often it would be quiet instead, how much of it would happen in whispers, intense like this, with only the sound of breathing to keep time. She adjusted the cloth again, gentler now. The man stirred, eyes fluttering open for a brief second. They didn't focus. They didn't accuse, they simply searched. Alina froze. This was the moment she hated most, the moment when someone looked at her like she might be the last solid thing in the room. "It's okay," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. She didn't know if he understood her language. It didn't matter. Her voice did what it was meant to do. His breathing steadied just slightly. That small change settled something in her chest. She straightened and reached for fresh bandages, telling herself again that she was just buying time. Minutes, maybe an hour, enough to hand him over later, enough to let someone else decide what came next. But even as she thought it, she felt how thin that excuse was, because she knew what happened to men like him when daylight came. A faint metallic clink echoed outside the tent. Alina's head snapped up. She held still, listening. Another sound followed, footsteps, slow and deliberate, not running, not panicked, approaching. Her pulse quickened. She moved instinctively, stepping between the cot and the entrance as if her body could hide the truth on its own. She adjusted a tray of tools, letting them shift just enough to make noise, normal noise, the kind people expected to hear in a place like this. The footsteps paused just outside. Alina kept her face calm, her hands busy, her breathing even. She didn't look at the flap. People tend to notice what you look at. For a long second, nothing happened. Then the footsteps moved on. Alina didn't relax right away. She counted silently, waiting for the sound to fade completely. Only then did she allow herself a shallow breath. She turned back to the cot. The man was still there, still breathing, still waiting whether he knew it or not. And in that quiet moment, before the night shifted again, Alina understood something she couldn't undo. She hadn't just treated a wound. She had made a choice. And the consequences of that choice were already moving closer, even if she couldn't see them yet. And then, somewhere beyond the canvas, she heard footsteps that didn't belong to the wind. Not running, not panicked, measured, coming closer. If stories like this stay with you, the kind that remind you what mercy costs, then you'll feel at home here. This is history captured. And if you'd like more real feeling stories from the past, told with heart, you can quietly subscribe and come back anytime. Alina didn't look up right away. She just kept her hands where they were and waited to find out who was about to step inside. Before the war, Alina used to believe that doing good was simple. You saw someone in need and you helped. You learned the rules, followed them carefully, and trusted that if you did your part, the world would meet you halfway. Back then, she thought morality worked like a straight line, clear, predictable, leading somewhere solid. War bent that line until it nearly broke. She'd become a nurse for practical reasons at first. It was something useful, something that made sense in a time when so much didn't. Hospitals needed hands, the wounded kept coming, and helping felt like a way to stay human while everything else hardened around her. She never imagined it would place her here, kneeling in a canvas tent, shielding an enemy soldier with her own body. Alina glanced again at the cot, checking his breathing out of habit, still shallow, still uneven, but holding. That mattered more than anything else right now. She remembered her first days near the front, how carefully she'd folded bandages, how she'd flinched at every sudden sound, how older nurses had moved with a calm that felt almost unreal, like nothing could shake them anymore. She wondered when, or if she would become like that. Now she knew. You don't become calm by being fearless. You become calm by surviving enough moments where fear doesn't get a vote. Alina reached for a cup of water and dampened a cloth, wiping sweat and dirt from the man's forehead. He stirred slightly but didn't wake. His face tightened for a second, then relaxed again, as if his body had decided to trust the quiet. That trust made her chest ache. She looked away, forcing herself to think about anything else. About home. About a kitchen that smelled like bread instead of antiseptic. About evenings where silence meant rest, not danger. Those memories felt distant now, like scenes from a life she'd once overheard rather than lived. Outside, the camp shifted. A radio crackled somewhere nearby, voices bleeding into static before cutting out again. Orders were being passed, schedules adjusted, the machinery of war grinding forward without noticing what it crushed along the way. Alina listened, gauging distance, urgency. The sounds weren't close enough yet to panic, but they were close enough to matter. She knew what would happen if someone discovered him here. She'd seen it before. Not this exact situation, but close enough to understand the outcome. There would be no long discussion, no careful weighing of circumstances. War didn't have the patience for nuance. That understanding pressed down on her, heavy and unavoidable. She sat back on her heels, hands resting in her lap, and let herself acknowledge the truth she'd been circling since the moment she touched him. This wasn't temporary. She wasn't just stabilizing him. She was choosing to carry him forward into whatever came next. Questions, suspicion, consequences she couldn't fully see yet. Alina closed her eyes briefly, breathing in the familiar smells of cloth and oil and metal. She grounded herself the way she'd been taught, one breath, then another. When she opened her eyes, she felt different, not braver, just clearer. She stood and checked the entrance again, still quiet, still safe for now. That wouldn't last. Alina knelt beside the cot once more, lowering her voice even though no one else was there to hear it. "You're not supposed to be my responsibility," she murmured, more confession than complaint. The man didn't answer. He didn't need to, because responsibility, she was learning, doesn't always come from orders. Sometimes it comes from the moment you decide not to walk away. And Alina had already stayed long enough to know there was no going back to the person she'd been before this night. As she reached for fresh supplies, she felt it clearly now, the fragile calm before the next test. The moment where the past no longer protects you, and the future hasn't revealed its price yet. Somewhere beyond the tent, someone was already moving closer, and whatever happened next would demand more than quiet courage. Alina noticed the change before she could explain it. It wasn't dramatic, no sudden movement, no sharp sound. Just a subtle shift in the way the man's breathing settled, as if his body had finally decided she wasn't a threat. The rhythm wasn't strong, but it was steadier, intentional. That mattered. She adjusted the bandage again, slower now, more careful than before. The lantern cast soft shadows across his face, revealing details she hadn't let herself see earlier. A faint scar near his jaw. Dirt pressed into the lines of his skin. The kind of face that could have belonged to anyone, anywhere, before the war decided otherwise. Up close, the uniform stopped speaking for him. Alina focused on her hands, but her mind kept drifting. It always did when things grew quiet. Quiet made room for thoughts she usually kept buried, questions she didn't have time for. The man stirred, his fingers twitching slightly against the blanket. Alina froze, then leaned in, ready to steady him if needed. His eyes opened slowly this time, not wide with panic, not darting around the tent. They found her instead. He looked at her like someone waking from deep water, unsure what was real yet. His brow creased and his lips parted as if he wanted to speak. No sound came out, just breath. Alina didn't pull away. She held his gaze just long enough to let him know he wasn't alone, not explaining, not promising, just present. This was the moment that unsettled her most. Because fear, she understood, pain too, she knew how to respond to both. But this quiet recognition felt different, harder to manage. She reached for the cloth and dabbed gently at his temple. He flinched at first, then relaxed when nothing followed. His shoulders eased by a fraction, and Alina felt the smallest release in her own chest. It shouldn't have mattered, but it did. She'd been taught to think in categories: friendly, hostile, priority, non-priority. The war ran on categories. They made decisions faster, cleaner. Yet here, in this narrow space between canvas walls, categories felt useless. He wasn't a symbol. He wasn't a uniform. He was a man who was hurt, who was afraid, and who was watching her like she might decide whether he lived or didn't. Alina swallowed and looked away first. She busied herself with supplies, not because they were urgent, but because she needed something solid to focus on. She listened to the sounds outside again, boots moving past, a low conversation, metal scraping against metal. Life continuing, indifferent. When she looked back, his eyes were still on her. He murmured something then, barely audible. A few syllables in a language she didn't understand. The tone wasn't demanding, it wasn't sharp. It sounded like a question. Alina shook her head gently. "I don't know," she whispered, even though he couldn't understand the words. "I really don't." But the honesty mattered more than the language. He seemed to accept that. His eyes closed again, not in defeat but in exhaustion. His breathing stayed steady. Trust, once offered, wasn't taken back. That realization settled heavy in Alina's chest. Because once someone trusts you like that, you stop being invisible in their story. She sat back, hands resting in her lap, and stared at the dirt floor for a moment. She thought about how many people pass through tents like this every day. How few of them left a mark, how this one already had. The war outside hadn't changed. The orders hadn't softened. Nothing about the situation had improved, except one thing. Alina no longer saw an enemy soldier on the cot. She saw a human being whose life was now tied, however briefly, to her willingness to stay. And that made everything ahead more dangerous than before. The first sign of trouble wasn't a shout or an alarm. It was the way the air outside the tent changed, thicker somehow, as if the camp had stopped moving and started paying attention. Alina felt it before she heard it. The quiet had shifted. It no longer felt empty. It felt watchful. She stood slowly, every movement measured. This was the danger of staying too long, not the dramatic kind, the ordinary kind, the kind that creeps in while you're focused on keeping someone alive. Alina checked the entrance again, listening carefully. Voices now, close, not hurried. Conversations like that never were. People who rushed made mistakes. People who walked slowly were usually looking for something. She glanced back at the cot. The man was awake again, eyes half open, following her movements. He sensed it too. Humans were good at that, reading the space before understanding the reason. His fingers tightened slightly against the blanket, then stilled when she raised her hand. "Stay quiet." He nodded once. That nod tightened something inside her chest. Trust again. Quiet, heavy, unavoidable. Alina reached for a tray and adjusted it, letting the metal clink softly. Normal sounds, expected sounds. She made herself busy the way she'd seen others do when they wanted to look unremarkable. Efficiency was its own kind of camouflage. A shadow passed across the tent wall. Alina didn't turn toward it. She focused on her hands instead, counting breaths that weren't hers. 1, 2, 3. The canvas shifted. "Alina," a voice called from just outside, female, familiar. Her heart jumped before she could stop it. "Marta," she answered, keeping her tone even. The flap opened slightly and Marta leaned in, her expression tired in the way only people near the front ever looked. Not exhausted, just worn down enough to stop reacting to things that used to matter. "I heard you were still here," Marta said, glancing around the tent. Her eyes moved quickly, cataloging. Lantern, supplies, cot. Alina positioned herself a half step closer to the cot without thinking. "Just finishing up," she replied. Marta nodded, then frowned. "You should have rotated out already." "I know," Alina said. "He took longer than expected." Marta's gaze flicked to the covered shape on the cot. The pause was brief, but Alina felt it stretch. This was the part no one prepared you for. Not the blood, not the screams, the explaining. Marta stepped farther inside, boots pressing into the dirt. "Supplies are running low," she said casually. "We're being asked to account for everything now." Alina felt her pulse quicken, but she kept her face neutral. "They always say that." Marta huffed a quiet laugh, then reached into her pocket. She placed a small roll of gauze on the table. "Take this, you'll need it." Alina stared at the gauze. It was either kindness or a warning. She met Marta's eyes. "Thank you." Marta didn't smile. She glanced once more toward the cot, then back at Alina. Her voice lowered. "Just don't stay too long," she said. "People are getting curious. Curious." That word landed harder than any threat. Marta stepped back, letting the canvas fall into place behind her. The tent returned to its dim stillness, but the quiet felt different now. Fragile, compromised. Alina didn't move until the sound of footsteps faded completely. Only then did she release the breath she'd been holding. She turned toward the cot, her hands trembling despite her effort to steady them. The man was watching her, eyes wide now, alert. He hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound. She crouched beside him. "You did well," she whispered. He didn't understand the words, but he understood her face. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly. That was when Alina realized the truth she'd been avoiding. This wasn't just her risk anymore. If this went wrong, it wouldn't only be her who paid for it. She straightened, thinking fast. Marta's visit hadn't been accidental. Even if she hadn't seen anything, the tent was no longer invisible. That protection was gone, which meant staying here wasn't an option. Alina gathered what she could: water, cloth, the bare essentials, tucking them where they wouldn't draw attention. Every movement felt deliberate now, final. She wasn't reacting anymore, she was planning. Outside, a whistle blew, short, sharp, orders being passed. The camp was shifting into another phase, and with it came new eyes, new rules. Alina leaned over the cot one last time. "We can't stay," she murmured, even though he might not understand. "Not much longer." He watched her, breathing steady, waiting. And in that moment, Alina knew the next choice would be different from the first. The first had been quiet, instinctive. The next would be visible. And once she made it, there would be no pretending this was just about saving a life. It would be about defying the shape the war had tried to force her into, and stepping somewhere she couldn't step back from. Alina waited for the camp to grow louder. It was a habit she'd learned without realizing it, timing her actions to noise, letting chaos cover what she didn't want seen. When engines started up and voices rose all at once, people stopped watching each other. Attention scattered. That was when she moved. She slipped back to the cot and crouched beside him, speaking low and steady. "We're leaving," she said, not as a question. "Slowly, when I tell you." He watched her face, then nodded. Always that nod, careful, trusting. Alina slid his arm over her shoulder and took his weight bit by bit. He was heavier than he looked, his body stiff with pain he was trying not to show. She adjusted her stance, grounding herself the way she'd been taught, feet planted, breath controlled. This wasn't about strength, it was about balance. They stood together for a moment, listening. Outside, someone laughed too loudly. A crate slammed shut. A voice barked an order, followed by the scrape of boots. The camp was alive now, restless and distracted. Alina guided him toward the back of the tent, toward the flap most people forgot existed. Each step felt louder than it was. Each pause stretched time thin. At the edge, she hesitated. This was the line. If someone saw them like this, no bandage tray, no explanations, there would be no confusion about what she was doing, no room for misunderstandings. The choice would be visible. She felt his grip tighten on her sleeve, not pulling, asking. Alina didn't look back at the cot or the supplies or the lantern she'd left behind. She looked at him and nodded once, as if that settled everything. Then she stepped out. The air outside was colder, sharper against her skin. Light from nearby lamps cast long, uneven shadows across the ground. Alina kept her head down and her pace deliberate, moving the way people do when they know exactly where they're going. People rarely stop you when you look certain. They passed between tents, then past stacks of crates and coiled rope. Alina steered them toward the supply area, where clutter hid shapes and no one lingered longer than necessary. The man stumbled once, catching himself before she could react. She tightened her hold and kept moving. They reached a narrow gap between tents and stopped. Alina leaned him against the canvas, shielding him with her body while she listened. Engines idled nearby. Voices drifted past, close enough to raise her pulse, far enough to ignore. She waited for the right moment. When it came, it was subtle, a lull between commands, a pocket of soundless movement. Alina opened a small flap in the back of a supply tent and guided him inside. The space was cramped and dim, filled with the smell of fuel and damp fabric. Crates were stacked high, casting deep shadows. Alina lowered him carefully behind them, out of sight if someone only glanced in. He winced, then steadied. His breathing evened out as she knelt to check the bandage again. Still holding, barely, she handed him a cup. "Small sips," she whispered. He drank, slow and careful, then looked at her like he wanted to say something. The words came out soft and broken in a language she didn't know. She didn't need to, it was thanks and something like apology. Alina nodded once. It was all she had time for. Outside, the camp surged again. Orders sharper now, engines louder, movement with purpose. Whatever was coming, it was coming soon. Alina stood and smoothed her uniform, feeling the weight of the moment settle into her bones. From here on, hiding wouldn't be enough. Timing wouldn't save her. She decrossed the line for good. And as she stepped back into the noise, leaving him in shadow and silence, Alina understood the final truth of it. Mercy doesn't end when you make the choice. It follows you into the next step and the next, until the war decides what it will ask in return. You can tell when a place is about to disappear, not because it's empty, but because no one treats it like it will last. Crates get shut without care, conversations short, people stop sitting down. The camp moved that way now, forward without looking back. Alina stood at the edge of the supply tents and watched it happen. She didn't go back inside. She knew better. Staying would turn into a pattern, and patterns were how people got caught. Instead, she positioned herself where she could see the flow of movement without being part of it, listening for changes, for raised voices, for anything that might point back toward the shadows she'd left behind. Nothing did, for now. The war rolled on indifferent, orders were shouted, engines pulled away. Somewhere a whistle blew, sharp and final. Units shifted, lines rearranged, and within minutes the camp no longer felt like the one she'd been in all night. That was how it always worked. Places vanished. Moments didn't. Alina felt the weight of that truth settle in her chest as she adjusted her pack and fell back into step with the others. No one looked at her twice. No one asked where she'd been. To them, she was just another nurse doing what needed to be done. Useful, replaceable, invisible, and that was exactly what kept her safe. As the convoy moved, Alina allowed herself one last glance toward the supply tents, now half hidden by dust and distance. She didn't expect to see anything. She didn't expect an answer, but she hoped. Not for a miracle, not for a perfect ending, just for a chance. She thought about the man sitting behind those crates, about the way his eyes had followed her not with fear but with understanding, about the way trust had passed between them without language, without promises that couldn't be kept. She didn't know what would happen to him. She didn't know if mercy would be enough. But she knew what she'd chosen. War would never remember that moment. It would record movements, victories, losses. It would count bodies and redraw maps and move on. History would compress nights like this into footnotes if it noticed them at all. But Alina would remember. She would remember the weight of a body leaning into hers, the quiet nod, the choice made in a tent where no one was supposed to see. Years later, long after the uniforms were folded away, long after the noise faded, this would still be the moment that stayed. Not because it changed the war, but because it changed her. Because in a place designed to strip people down to roles and orders, she had chosen to act as something else entirely. A witness, a protector, a human being. And that is how mercy survives wars, not in speeches or victories, but in the small, dangerous moments when someone decides that another life is worth the risk. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you that even in history's darkest corners, choice still exists, then you're already part of why these moments matter. This is history captured, and we're here to remember the quiet decisions that history almost forgot.